The money was still there. Cash, savings, the small valuables a household keeps in a drawer, every bit of it untouched. What the intruder carried away over several trips into the dark was food. 4 straw bales of unhulled grain, a sack of milled rice, and a wooden frame to carry them on his back. Behind him, in a farmhouse standing alone on a hillside in southern Nagano, 7 people lay dead. A 38-year-old widow, her 4 children, 12, 9, 6, and 3 years old, her younger sister, 25, and the sister's little girl, who was 3. They had all been asleep. None of them woke. For 15 years, the police of Nagano Prefecture chased this case harder than any case in the prefecture's history. Over 10,000 days of investigator time, hundreds of people questioned, a weapon left behind at the scene carrying a maker's mark that should have led them straight to a name. And still, at midnight on the 10th of May 1961, the clock ran out, and the file was closed with 3 words: offender unknown. This is the story of a massacre committed for a few bales of stolen grain in a country so hungry that the detectives hunting the killer were themselves losing 10 kilos from their own bodies, and of how a case that looked solvable on day 1 was in fact already lost. To understand what happened on that hillside, you have to understand what Japan was in the spring of 1946. The war had ended 9 months earlier. The cities were ash. 6 million people were coming home, soldiers demobilized from the continent, families evacuated from bombed-out neighborhoods, all returning to a country that could not feed the people already in it. The 1945 harvest had failed. Imports from the colonies had stopped. The official ration was thin, delivered late, and sometimes not delivered at all. In Tokyo that year, a judge would starve to death rather than eat black market food, and his death made national news precisely because everyone else was buying it. Which brings us to the countryside. In a farming valley, rice was not a meal. It was currency, insurance, and the difference between a family surviving the winter and not. City people rode packed trains out to villages with kimono and watches and wedding rings, hoping to trade them for something to eat. That trade was illegal. It was also the reason a great many people were still alive. And it means that in a hamlet like this one, almost every household had something to hide from the authorities, a quiet stock of grain that the government said should not be there. Hold on to that, because it will matter enormously later. The place itself was Oshimayama, a hillside settlement in Ichida village in the Shimoina district of southern Nagano. Today, it is part of the town of Takamore. Mountains on both sides, the Tenryu River running down the middle of the valley, silk mills and mulberry fields, and terraced houses scattered up the slope. Near the top of that slope, set apart from its neighbors, stood a single farmhouse. The woman who ran it was 38, and she had been widowed the previous year. She was raising the children alone, 3 boys and a girl, the eldest 12, the youngest 3. Living with them was her younger sister, who was 25 and had worked as a nurse in Tokyo before coming home, and the sister's 3-year-old daughter. 7 people, 1 house, no close neighbors in sight, and a lane that climbed away from the rest of the hamlet into the trees. Nobody saw what happened in that house. There were no survivors, and the family was found more than a day later. Everything that follows was reconstructed by investigators from the scene itself. Sometime around 11 at night on the 9th of May, a man came up the hill carrying a firewood axe, not one from the house. Police would later establish that he brought it with him. Inside, the family was asleep on their futons. The 7 of them were killed where they lay, each struck once or twice about the head. Every one of them died instantly. There was no sign of a struggle anywhere in the house, no overturned furniture, no defensive injuries, nothing to suggest that a single person had woken up. Then the intruder went to the grain store. He took 4 straw bales of unhulled rice, roughly 15 kilos of milled rice, and a wooden carrying frame from the house. A bale of that period weighed about 60 kilos. Even for a strong man, that is not one trip up a dark lane. It is several journeys out of a house of the dead and back again. He left the money, he left the valuables, and he left the axe. Then he walked out, and for the next 31 hours, nothing happened at all. The house stood quiet on its hillside through the whole of the following day, and nobody thought that strange, because nobody could see it. It was about 6 in the evening on the 10th of May when a woman from the hamlet climbed the lane with a small celebration gift for the family. She called at the door. No one answered. She called again. Still nothing. And the silence of a house with small children in it is a loud kind of silence. There was a tear in the paper of one of the sliding doors. She looked through it, and in the dim room beyond, she saw a face she knew, darkened with dried blood. She ran for the neighbors. Relatives and villagers came up the hill, and they went inside, and they found all 7. At 10 minutes to 8, a neighbor reached the village police box by telephone. 14 minutes later, the message arrived at Ida police station, down in the city. By the time the first officers got up that lane, the scene had already been walked through by frightened, grieving people who had moved the bodies and handled the axe, and by then it had also rained. The response was enormous. Nagano Prefectural Police set up an investigation headquarters at Ruriji, a temple near the scene, and kept it running for 6 months. 81 officers were assigned. In the first 3 months alone, they burned through roughly 8,000 days of investigator time. And at first, the evidence looked extraordinarily good. Start with the weapon. It was a yoki, the heavy wedge-shaped axe that mountain households used for splitting firewood. Oak handle, about 90 centimeters. Head weighing close to 3 kilos. It was rusted red and hadn't been used in about a year, which told investigators something immediately. This was not a working tool grabbed in the heat of the moment. It had been sitting somewhere, unused, until someone picked it up and carried it up a hill at night. Better still, it was stamped. A single character was struck into the head of the axe, the first character of the village's own name. That mark let police do something rare for 1946, trace a murder weapon back to its origin. 10 of these axes had been forged in 1930 in a neighboring village. A resident of the lower part of Ichida had brought them, and 7 had been delivered to the local silk reeling cooperative, where they were used to split wood for the boilers. So the police had a closed list: 7 axes, 1 workplace, a finite number of people who could have taken one. They investigated 293 individuals connected to those axes, cooperative staff, suppliers, anyone who came and went from the yard. Beyond that, they checked around 400 more people across the surrounding towns and the city of Ida. Men with theft records, men suddenly spending beyond their means, food brokers, demobilized soldiers, recent arrivals. And the trail simply stopped. Of the 10 axes, 6 had already gone missing at some point between 1930 and the beginning of 1946. 3 were established as stolen. The whereabouts of 4 were never accounted for at all. And the man who had been responsible for keeping the cooperative's tools, the one person who might have known who had access to them, had left for Manchuria in 1943, in the last years of the empire, and was never traced. The single best piece of physical evidence in the case led back to a storeroom whose keeper had vanished into a collapsed colony on the other side of a war. Meanwhile, there was the rice. It was found quickly, hidden in a sweet potato storage cave cut into the hillside about 300 meters from the house, in the Yoshida area of the village. 4 bales, exactly as taken, and one of them carried traces of blood. Here, the investigation had its best and simplest chance. The killer had gone to enormous risk for that food and then left it behind in a hole in the ground. Sooner or later, hungry as he would come back for it. So the police mounted a secret watch on the cave. The operation leaked. In a hamlet of a few hundred people, word that officers were lying in wait moved faster than the officers did. They held the position for 2 days. Nobody came. The food that 7 people had died for was never collected. From what they had, investigators built a profile. 1 man, acting alone, 1 weapon, 1 set of footprints, and the repeated trips needed to move the bales. Physically strong, left-handed, police believed, from the pattern of blood on the handle. Someone with local knowledge who knew that a widow lived apart from her neighbors and that there was grain in her store. In other words, not a stranger passing through the valley, almost certainly someone who belonged to it. So why, with a marked weapon, a recovered haul, and a suspect pool that could be counted, did this case never close? Start with the first day, because that is where most of it was lost. The killings happened at night in an isolated house. Discovery came 31 hours later. In between, it rained and the footprints outside were gone. When neighbors found the bodies, they did what any human being does. They went in, they moved the dead, they picked up the axe. Fingerprints and footprints could never be adequately recovered afterwards, and the forensic science available to a rural prefecture in 1946 was thin to begin with. There was no way to type the blood on that bale to a particular person. Then there was the village itself. Investigators found a community that would not talk to them, and the reason was not simple loyalty to the killer. It was rice. Officers stationed in the hamlet meant officials watching who moved grain and where, and the black market was how these households were eating. A police presence was, quite literally, a threat to survival. On top of that, people were afraid of being drawn into the case at all, in a place where an accusation could destroy a family. That fear had consequences. In the weeks after the murders, neighbors began accusing neighbors. One villager named another as the killer. The accusation came back at him in turn. 3 months after the family died, that man took his own life. Whether he had any connection to the crime was never established, and the sources do not support the idea that he did. What killed him was the rumor. And then there was hunger inside the investigation. The detectives working this case were living on the same failed harvest as everyone else. Accounts from the time describe men who were, in their own words, eating grass. Most of them lost between 5 and 10 kilos of body weight during the search. 3 months in, the special investigation was cut from 81 officers to 17, not because the leads were exhausted, but because the country could not afford to feed a manhunt. After that, it dwindled to 2 detectives at Ida Station, keeping the file alive year after year. They did get one confession. In April 1949, a man from Nagano who had been arrested for theft over in Toyama Prefecture announced that he was the killer.
His account did not match the evidence, and it soon emerged why he had told it. He wanted to be sent to a prison closer to home. That was the closest anyone ever came.
There are three explanations that have circulated about this case, and they are not equally strong. Rather than list them, let me test each against three questions the evidence can actually answer: what was taken, what was left behind, and what the investigation itself lost. The first is the police working theory, desperation. A local man, starving, who knew that a widow's house stood apart from the others with grain inside it. On what was taken, it fits perfectly. Only food, nothing else, from a household that also had cash. On what was left behind, it fits too. The axe abandoned at the scene is the mark of someone who came to steal and found 7 people in the way, not someone who planned an execution. But it has one weakness, and it is real. If you kill for food, you eat the food. He never came back for it. Which is exactly where the second explanation comes from, the village's own theory, that the food was a decoy and the real motive was a grudge. It answers the one thing desperation can't, the uncollected haul. But look what it costs. It requires a man who staged a robbery so convincing that he hauled 60-kilo bales up a hillside in several trips, then abandoned the entire performance rather than complete it. And it has to explain away the far simpler reason he never returned, that within about a day, the whole valley knew what had happened and police were sitting on that cave. He didn't need a motive to stay away. He needed only to hear the news. The third reading is the one I find hardest to argue with, and it is not about the killer at all. It is that this case was decided in its first 24 hours, and everything afterwards was ceremony. Consider the sequence. The murders happen at night in a house nobody can see. 31 hours pass. Rain removes the exterior evidence. Villagers enter and disturb the interior evidence. Only then do the police arrive, a police force being rebuilt from the ground up in an occupied country, working in a prefecture recording dozens of killings a year, with almost no forensic capacity and, within 12 weeks, no budget to feed its own detectives. Now line that up against the physical evidence they did have. The marked axe was traceable, and they traced it into a storeroom whose keeper had disappeared into Manchuria 3 years before. The stolen grain was recovered, and the trap they set on it failed for the most ordinary reason imaginable. In a small place, secrets don't hold. Even the last serious effort in 1961, when the National Police Agency finally tested the blood on that bale, returned a result that was true and useless at the same time: human blood, unattributable to anyone. Every route out of this case was closed not by a clever offender, but by circumstance, weather, delay, poverty, war, and the ordinary behavior of frightened neighbors. That is the uncomfortable conclusion. There may never have been a mastermind here. There was a hungry man with a stolen tool and a country too broken in that particular year to catch him. The end came quietly. On the 6th of May, 1961, the case went to prosecutors marked offender unknown. On the 9th, the investigation was formally closed. At midnight on the 10th, 15 years to the hour, the statute of limitations expired. It was the first post-war murder in Nagano to run out the clock. About a year later, the case file was destroyed. 4,000 pages of statements, diagrams, and 15 years of 2 detectives' work disposed of as routine. The Valley did not talk about it. For decades, the subject was close to taboo in the town,
until 2 robbery murders of elderly residents in 2004, the first killings there in 58 years, brought 1946 back to the surface for a while. 7 people were killed in their sleep for 4 bales of rice. Nobody was ever charged, and the only man who could have told us why has been dead for a long time, in a village where everybody probably knew his face. What do you think happened on that hillside? Was he simply a starving neighbor who took what he needed and then couldn't go back for it? Or was the food never the point at all?